Her husband and her son's wife betrayed her in the most cruel and intimate way imaginable. What do you do when your entire family implodes from within? This is her harrowing, true-to-life story of navigating utter heartbreak and finding an unexpected, resilient strength.
You think you know a man after 50 years of marriage? 50 years of sharing a bed, a life, a heart? 50 years of raising a son, watching him grow, seeing him bring home a woman you hoped would be like a daughter to you? Honey, let me tell you. Vivian Holloway learned the hard way that 50 years can be a beautifully crafted lie, a comfortable quilt hiding a nest of vipers. And the deepest cut, when one of those vipers is family, twice over. My name is Vivian, 67 years young, or so I like to tell myself before my world imploded. I had a good life, a simple one, here in Charleston. My Robert, he wasn't a rich man, but he was steady, or so I believed, a retired postal worker, quiet, a man of routine. We had our little house, our garden, our son Michael, our pride and joy, and then Michael brought home Linda. Linda, pretty as a picture, all blonde curls and sweet smiles. Butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. She was younger than Michael, a bit flighty, I thought, but she seemed to adore him, and he was head over heels. As his mother, I welcomed her. I taught her my secret recipe for pecan pie, shared stories of Michael's childhood, opened my home and my heart to her, my daughter-in-law, the woman who was supposed to complete our family circle. Oh, if you truly knew the depths of the betrayal that was brewing right under my own roof, right under my unsuspecting nose, you'd understand why I'm telling this story. It's a confession, yes, but it's also a warning, because the people you trust the most, the ones you love with every fiber of your being, they're the ones who can inflict the cruelest wounds. And what happened next, what I found out, it didn't just break my heart, it damn near shattered my soul. But we'll get to the ugliest parts. First, you need to understand how perfect it all seemed just before the storm hit. Life was comfortable. Robert had his fishing buddies. I had my church group and my quilting circle. Michael and Linda would come over for Sunday dinner. Linda would help me in the kitchen, her laughter bright, her questions about my recipes always so attentive. She'd call me Mama Vivian, tell me how lucky she was to have such a wonderful mother-in-law. And I, fool that I was, I believed her. I had even started knitting a little baby blanket, a little secret hope I harbored for them. There were signs, I suppose, little things. A lingering glance between Robert and Linda that I'd dismiss as my overactive imagination. Robert suddenly taking more interest in his appearance, a new cologne, a jauntier step. Linda asking a few too many questions about our finances, about Robert's pension, all under the guise of making sure you two are taken care of, Mama Vivian. I'd brush these things aside. An old woman's foolishness, I'd tell myself. Jealousy, perhaps, that my son's wife was young and beautiful, and I was 67. The day it all crashing down started like any other Tuesday. Robert had gone off early, said he was meeting an old friend from the post office for breakfast. Michael was at work. Linda was supposed to be at some yoga class she'd recently joined. I was in my garden, tending my prize-winning azaleas, the morning sun warm on my back. It was peaceful. Deceptively so. I'd forgotten my good gardening shears inside, the ones Frank, my first husband, God rest his soul, had given me. I went back into the house, humming an old gospel tune. Our bedroom door, Robert's and mine, was slightly ajar. That was unusual. Robert was always meticulous about closing doors. I heard a sound, a giggle, Linda's giggle. My blood ran cold. What was Linda doing here? In my house, in my bedroom, when Robert was supposedly out for breakfast and she was at yoga? I'm not a brave woman by nature, not the confrontational type, but something primal, a cold dread mixed with a rising tide of disbelief, propelled me forward. I pushed the door open. And there they were, my husband, Robert, my daughter-in-law, Linda. In my bed. Our bed. The bed I had shared with Robert for 30 years, the bed where our son Michael had been conceived. The details, oh Lord, the details are seared into my brain like a brand. Her blonde hair spread across my pillow, his hand, the hand that had held mine for so many years, tangled in that same hair. The look of shock, then guilt, then a defiant, ugly smirk on Linda's face when she saw me. Robert just looked like a cornered, pathetic old fool. The world stopped. The air in the room turned to ice. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare, my mind a screaming void, as 50 years of trust, of love, of shared life shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before my eyes. My husband and my son's wife. The ultimate betrayal, a double-edged knife plunged straight into my heart and into the heart of my family. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a desecration.
Vivian's world has collapsed. How will she cope with this double betrayal from her closest loved ones? Her confession is just beginning, and what she does next will change everything.
My legs, I think, gave out then. Or maybe it was my will. I remember sinking, not gracefully, but in a boneless, clumsy heap onto the hallway floor just outside my desecrated bedroom. The vibrant colors of the runner Frank had bought me on our trip to New Mexico blurring before my eyes. Sounds seemed to come from a great distance. A startled yelp. Linda, I think. A muffled curse. Robert, definitely. The frantic rustle of sheets and clothing. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even summon the strength for a single cleansing scream. There was just this vast, echoing silence inside me, a void where my heart used to be. How long I sat there, I don't know. Time had fractured, just like everything else. Eventually, Robert appeared in the doorway, hastily buttoning his shirt, his face a ghastly shade of gray, his eyes darting everywhere but at me. He looked old, older than I'd ever seen him. Pathetic. "Vivian?" he stammered, his voice a dry rasp. "Vivian, it's not what you think." Not what I think? What did he imagine I was thinking? That they were in my bed in broad daylight discussing scripture? The absurdity of it, even in my shock, was a fresh stab of pain. Linda scurried out from behind him then, her blonde hair a tangled mess, her pretty face flushed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a brazen defiance that made my blood boil, even through the layers of numbness. She couldn't even look at me properly, her gaze skittering away like a frightened roach. She mumbled something incoherent, an apology, an excuse, and then she fled, scurried down the stairs and out of my house, out of my life, leaving behind the stench of her cheap perfume and the wreckage of 2 families. Robert just stood there, a monument to his own shame. 50 years, Robert. I finally managed to whisper, my voice a thread. 50 years. And our son, Michael, his wife. The words died in my throat. The enormity of it, the sheer, calculated cruelty of their betrayal was too vast to articulate. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. What could he say? What possible excuse could there be for this abomination? I didn't wait for him to find the words. Slowly, painfully, using the wall for support, I pulled myself to my feet. Every bone in my body ached, but it was nothing compared to the ache in my soul. I looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time seeing the stranger he had become, or perhaps the stranger he had always been, hidden beneath a veneer of quiet dependability. "Get out, Robert," I said, my voice flat, devoid of inflection. "Vivian, please, get out." Each word was a shard of ice. "Take your things and don't ever come back." I didn't shout. I didn't scream. There was a cold, dead calm inside me now, the calm of a battlefield after the slaughter. He saw something in my eyes then, something that finally seemed to penetrate his own self-absorption. He saw that the Vivian he knew, the wife who had always been there, always forgiven, always understood, was gone. And in her place was this hollowed-out woman with eyes like frozen pools. He didn't argue. He just nodded, his shoulders slumped, and turned away, a broken old man heading towards a future he had single-handedly destroyed. The rest of that day is a blur. I remember wandering through my house now, touching things, Frank's old armchair, Michael's childhood drawings still tacked to the back of his old bedroom door, the quilt I had been making for Linda's baby, the baby that might never be, or worse, might be born into this maelstrom of deceit. Each object was a fresh torment. How would I tell Michael, my son, my kind, loving Michael, who adored his wife, who trusted his father? This news would destroy him. It would shatter his world just as surely as it had shattered mine. The thought of inflicting that pain on him was almost more than I could bear. But he had to know. He deserved to know the truth, however ugly. The call was the hardest I'd ever had to make. Harder than telling him his grandfather Frank had passed. Harder than anything. His initial disbelief, then the dawning horror in his voice, then the raw, animalistic cry of pain. It will haunt me to my dying day. He said he was coming home, right away. And so I waited. Waited for my son to arrive. Waited for the next wave of anguish to hit. Waited for the world to make some kind of sense again, though I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the core that it never, ever would. My confession had only just begun, and the path ahead was shrouded in a darkness so profound I couldn't see a single star to guide me. The betrayal wasn't just an act. It was a chasm, and I was teetering on its very edge.
The betrayal is revealed. Vivian's world is destroyed. Her son, Michael, is coming home, unaware of the full depth of the tragedy. How will they both survive this blow? And what will Vivian do when faced with the betrayal of her closest loved ones? This is only the beginning of her confession.
The hours I waited for Michael to arrive felt like walking barefoot over broken glass. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, Frank's clock, now a silent witness to this new, unimaginable sorrow, was a fresh stab of anxiety. How do you tell your son, your only child, that his father, the man he'd looked up to, and his wife, the woman he loved, had betrayed him in the most depraved way imaginable? There are no words for that kind of poison. No gentle way to deliver a blow that you know will shatter his world as thoroughly as it had shattered mine. When I finally heard his car pull into the driveway, my breath caught in my throat. I smoothed down my apron, a ridiculous instinctive gesture of normalcy in a world that was anything but normal. I opened the door before he could even knock, and the sight of him, his dear, familiar face etched with concern, and a confusion I knew was about to turn into agony, almost broke me. "Mama," he said, his voice tight, "what's happened? You sounded terrible on the phone. Is it Dad? Is he worse?" He thought Robert was just sick, you see. That was the lie Robert had been feeding us all for weeks. His supposed lingering flu that kept him home from his fishing trips, that made him too tired for much else. A convenient excuse, I now realized, for his other activities. I couldn't speak. I just pulled him inside, into the living room that suddenly felt tainted, every familiar object screaming of betrayal. He looked around, sensing the oppressive atmosphere, the wrongness of it all. "Mama, what is it?" he urged, his eyes searching mine. "Where's Dad? And where's Linda? I tried calling her on the way here, but her phone's off." Linda. Her name on his lips was like acid. I sank onto the sofa, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "Michael, son," I began, my voice trembling, "you need to sit down. There's something I have to tell you. Something terrible." And then the words came, tumbling out, disjointed, choked with a grief and a rage so profound I could barely breathe. I told him what I'd seen. In our bedroom. His father. His wife. I spared him none of the sordid, heartbreaking details, because he deserved the truth, however ugly. He deserved to know the full extent of their treachery. I watched his face as I spoke, watched the confusion turn to dawning horror, then to a stark, bone-deep disbelief. His skin turned ashen, his eyes wide and unseeing. He shook his head, slowly at first, then more violently. No, Mama, you must be mistaken. There has to be some explanation. Dad wouldn't, Linda wouldn't. I saw them, Michael, I said, my voice flat with a terrible certainty. With my own eyes. There's no mistake. The fight went out of him then. He slumped forward, his head in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with ragged, silent sobs. It was the sound of a man's world ending. My heart shattered all over again watching him, my strong, capable son, reduced to this quivering wreck of pain. I reached out, laid my hand on his back, a small, inadequate gesture of comfort in the face of such monumental desolation. We sat like that for a long time, mother and son, united in our shared heartbreak, adrift in the sea of betrayal. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked on, a cold, indifferent measure of our agony. When Michael finally raised his head, his face was a mask of grief and a terrifying cold fury I had never seen in him before. His eyes, so like Frank's, were bloodshot, but they held a new, hard light. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Where is that man who calls himself my father?" "He left," I said. "I told him to get out. He took some clothes. I don't know where he went." "And her?" His voice was like ice. "Linda?" "She ran out, like the coward she is." Michael stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked around the room, at the familiar objects, the photographs of their smiling faces, him and Linda on their wedding day, him and Frank on a fishing trip, and I saw a wave of nausea pass over him. He looked like he wanted to smash everything, to obliterate every reminder of the life he thought he'd had. "I'm going to find them," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm going to—" "No, Michael," I said, grabbing his arm, my own strength surprising me. "No, not like this. Not in anger. What good would it do? More pain? More ugliness?" He looked at me, his eyes wild. "But Mama, they have to pay. They can't just destroy us and walk away." "And they won't, son," I said, though at that moment I had no idea how I would make that true. "They won't. But revenge? It's a bitter satisfaction. Right now we need to breathe. We need to think. And we need to protect ourselves." Protect ourselves from what? I wasn't sure. The financial implications, the emotional fallout, the sheer unadulterated scandal of it all if it became public knowledge in our small community. He sank back onto the sofa, the fight momentarily draining out of him, replaced by a look of utter desolation. Our life, Mama. My marriage. Everything. It was all a lie. I know, baby, I whispered, my own tears starting to flow again. That night, Michael slept in his old childhood bed, or rather lay in it, staring at the ceiling, just as I lay in my own violated bed, staring into the darkness. Sleep was an impossibility for either of us. The house, once a haven, now felt like a tomb, haunted by the ghosts of broken vows and shattered trust. What do you do? The question from that imagined title echoed in my mind. What do you do when your husband sleeps with your daughter-in-law, when your entire world is built on a lie? Do you crumble? Do you rage? Do you seek revenge? Or do you somehow, some way, find the strength to simply survive? At that moment, survival felt like a monumental task. But as I lay there, listening to the occasional heartbroken sigh from my son's room, I knew one thing. I wasn't just surviving for myself anymore. I was surviving for Michael. He needed me now more than ever, and I would not, could not let him down. The betrayal had come from them, from Robert and Linda, but the strength to face it, to navigate this hell, would have to come from us, from mother and son, together.
The next morning dawned gray and cheerless, much like the mood in our house. Michael emerged from his room looking like he hadn't slept a wink, his eyes red-rimmed, his face drawn and haggard. The sight of him, my usually vibrant, confident son, so utterly defeated, stoked the embers of my own cold rage against Robert and Linda. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence thick and heavy, punctuated only by the clinking of spoons against ceramic as I forced us both to have some coffee and toast. Food felt like an obscenity, but I knew we needed strength. "What are we going to do, Mama?" Michael finally asked, his voice a hoarse whisper, staring into his untouched coffee cup as if it held the answers to the universe. That was the question, wasn't it? What do you do? My guiding title, the one that had been forming in my mind as I began to process this nightmare, echoed with that very helplessness. "First," I said, my voice firmer than I felt, "you need to decide about Linda, about your marriage." He flinched, as if I'd physically struck him. "Marriage?" he scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "What marriage? It was all a lie, Mama. Every touch, every smile, every I love you, all of it." "I know, baby," I said softly. "I know it feels that way now, but you need to think clearly, legally. You need to protect yourself. What's left of your assets, if she hasn't already." My voice trailed off, the thought of Linda's avarice adding another layer to the betrayal. He nodded slowly, the fight draining out of him again, replaced with a weary resignation. "A lawyer. I need to see a lawyer. Today." "Yes," I agreed. "And I need to figure out what to do about your father." The thought of Robert, of confronting him, filled me with a mixture of dread and a cold, hard anger. How could I ever look at him again without seeing him with her, in our bed? But I couldn't just let him vanish, could I? There were 50 years of shared life, however tainted they now seemed. There were practicalities, legalities, our house, our joint accounts, though I suspected Linda and Robert might have already made inroads there, too. "He needs to face what he's done, Mama," Michael said, his voice hardening again. "Both of them do. They can't just destroy 2 lives, 2 families, and expect to walk away clean. No. No, they can't." Later that day, Michael went to see a divorce lawyer. I stayed home, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I found myself wandering from room to room, a ghost in my own life. I picked up a framed photo of Robert and me, taken on our 40th anniversary, both of us smiling, looking for all the world like a happy, devoted couple. Had it all been a lie, even then?
Had he been deceiving me for years? Or was this affair with Linda a more recent, more desperate folly of an old man? The questions gnawed at me, unanswerable, tormenting. I tried calling Robert's cell phone again. This time, surprisingly, he answered. His voice was hesitant, wary. "Vivian?" "Robert," I said, my voice cold, devoid of the warmth it had held for him for half a century. "We need to talk. You owe me that much. You owe Michael that much." There was a long pause. I know, Viv," he finally said, his voice thick with what sounded like shame, or perhaps just self-pity. "Messed up doesn't quite cover it, Robert. You blew up our family. You betrayed your son. You desecrated our marriage. Where are you?" He wouldn't tell me. He mumbled something about needing time, about being confused. The coward. "You need to come home, Robert," though the thought of him back in this house made my skin crawl. "You need to face Michael. You need to face what you've done. Or so help me God, I will find you, and I will make you face it." It was a hollow threat, perhaps. What could an old woman like me really do? But the words felt good, a small release of the volcanic pressure building inside me. He hung up. The days that followed were a blur of lawyers, hushed conversations with Michael, sleepless nights, and an ever-present crushing weight on my heart. Michael initiated divorce proceedings against Linda. She, through her own lawyer, responded with a brazenness that astounded us both, claiming she was the aggrieved party, that Michael had been emotionally distant, that she was entitled to a significant portion of their, or rather his, assets. The viper had unsheathed her fangs. And Robert remained a ghost, a disembodied voice on the phone when he occasionally guiltily called, always refusing to say where he was, always full of self-pitying excuses. This was my life now, a battlefield of broken hearts and legal papers. My confession, the one I felt compelled to share, was just beginning to take shape, a chronicle of how love can turn to ashes, how trust can be so utterly, devastatingly betrayed. And the questions still hung heavy in the air every single day. What do you do? What can you do when the very foundations of your world have been ripped away by the people you loved most? I didn't have the answers yet. I only had the pain, the anger, and a growing, chilling resolve that this could not, would not be the end of my story.
Robert is on the run. Linda is bearing her fangs, and Michael is crushed. Vivian is left alone amidst the ruins of her family. But a cold resolve is dawning in her heart. What steps will she take to pick up the pieces of her life and respond to the betrayal? Her confession continues.
The weeks that followed felt like wading through thick, cloying mud. Every day was a battle, not just against the crushing weight of grief and betrayal, but against a system that seemed designed to pick apart the bones of a shattered family. Michael, bless his heart, threw himself into the divorce proceedings against Linda with a grim determination that mirrored my own. But I could see the toll it was taking on him. His lawyer, a sharp young woman named Miss Albright, no relation to the Mr. Albright from my previous musings about other women's stories, just a name that seemed to follow women fighting for their due, it seemed, was competent, but Linda was proving to be a slippery, venomous snake. She wasn't just contesting the divorce. She was demanding half of everything Michael owned, including a portion of what she claimed was his future inheritance from Robert and me. The audacity of it. She painted herself as the victim, a young wife abandoned by a neglectful husband, conveniently forgetting the small detail of her being found in her father-in-law's bed. Her lawyer,
a shark in a tailored suit, was just as shameless, using every trick in the book to delay, to obfuscate, to wear Michael down. I attended some of the preliminary hearings with Michael, sitting quietly in the back, my presence a silent statement of support for my son and a cold condemnation of the woman who had once called me Mama Vivian. Seeing Linda there, her face a mask of practiced innocence, her eyes darting around the courtroom with a look of martyred defiance, made my blood boil. How could someone so young be so utterly devoid of conscience, of shame? As for Robert, he remained a ghost. He'd call occasionally, his voice still thick with that infuriating self-pity, always from a blocked number, always brief. He'd ask how I was, how Michael was, as if he were some distant acquaintance inquiring after a mild ailment, not the architect of our family's ruin. "Robert," I said during one of these infuriating calls, my patience worn thin, This hiding, it's cowardly. You need to face what you've done. Michael needs to see you. I need to understand. 50 years, Robert. Don't they mean anything to you?" "Of course they do, Viv. It's complicated. I can't face him yet, or you." "Complicated?" I almost laughed. "You think this is complicated for you? Try living it from our side, Robert." He'd usually hang up soon after that, leaving me with a fresh wave of anger and a hollow ache in my chest. The question of my own marriage to him was a constant nagging pain. What was left of it? The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. The love I'd felt for him for half a century now felt like a cruel mirage. Miss Albright, Michael's lawyer, had gently suggested I should consider my own legal options regarding Robert, given his abandonment and the potential financial implications of his actions with Linda. "You need to protect yourself, Vivian, especially if Linda's trying to make claims on future assets," she'd said kindly. And so, with a heavy heart, I instructed Miss Albright to begin divorce proceedings against Robert as well. 50 years. Ending not with a quiet fading into old age together, but with lawyers and court documents and the bitter taste of betrayal. It felt like another death in the family. But amidst all this ugliness, something within me was hardening, solidifying. The initial shock and helpless grief were slowly, painstakingly, being replaced by a cold, clear resolve. I would not be a victim. I would not let them destroy what was left of my life or Michael's. The title of my unspoken confession, "What do you do when your husband secretly loves your daughter-in-law?" was no longer just a cry of despair. It was becoming a question I was determined to answer, not with tears, but with action. I started by taking control of my own small finances, what little I had that wasn't tied up with Robert. I opened a new bank account in my name only. I went through every drawer, every box in the house, looking for any papers, any information that might be useful to Miss Albright or that might shed some light on Robert and Linda's deceptions. It was during one of these searches, in the back of Robert's old desk drawer, a place I rarely ventured, that I found it. A small, plain, spiral-bound notebook tucked beneath a stack of old tax returns. It wasn't his usual neat handwriting. It was a messy scrawl, dates, names. Linda's name appeared frequently, and sums of money. Small sums at first, then larger, and cryptic notes. L, car payment. L, loan for an investment. L, emergency again. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just an affair. This was a systematic bleeding of funds. Linda hadn't just seduced Robert. She had been financially exploiting him for who knows how long before the final devastating betrayal. He hadn't just been a willing participant in an affair. He'd been a fool, a mark, complicit in draining our own resources for her benefit. This notebook, this sordid little ledger of his weakness and her greed, was a revelation. It was ugly, painful proof of a deeper layer of deceit than I had even imagined. But it was also ammunition. I sat there for a long time with the notebook in my lap, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with a sickening clarity. The trips that Linda had taken, the expensive new clothes she'd flaunted, her sudden emergencies that always seemed to require cash from Robert, it all made a horrible kind of sense now. My resolve hardened further. This wasn't just about protecting myself and Michael anymore. This was about justice. Linda wasn't just an adulteress. She was a con artist, a predator, and she had preyed on my family for too long. My confession would include this too, the full, unvarnished truth, and then, somehow, I would find a way to make her pay.
That grimy little notebook became my constant companion for the next few days. I read it over and over, each entry a fresh stab of pain and a new surge of cold, hard anger. Linda hadn't just been sleeping with my husband. She'd been systematically draining him, playing on his guilt, his weakness, whatever hold she had over him to finance her own lifestyle. And Robert, my foolish, infatuated Robert, had let her. He'd let her bleed them, us, dry, all while I was scrimping and saving, worrying about our future. The question was, what to do with this damning evidence? My first instinct was to march into Miss Albright's office, slap it on her desk, and demand she use it to destroy Linda in court. But a lifetime of quiet observation, of learning to navigate the subtle currents of human behavior, gave me pause. This was powerful, yes, but power, I knew, had to be wielded carefully, at the right time, in the right way. I spoke to Michael first. He was still reeling from the initial betrayal, struggling to get through each day, but the legal battle with Linda, her outrageous demands, had lit a spark of anger in him too. When I showed him the notebook, his face went pale, then flushed with a deep, furious red. That scheming, manipulative, he choked out, his hands clenching into fists. All those times she said she needed money for classes, for investments for us, for her sick aunt, it was all lies. She was playing him, playing us all. Yes, son, I said quietly. She was, and this proves it. This shows a pattern of exploitation that goes beyond just the affair. We have to give this to Miss Albright immediately. This will destroy Linda's claims. This will show her for the gold-digging fraud she is. And that's what we did. Miss Albright was, to put it mildly, intrigued. Her sharp legal mind immediately saw the implications. "This is dynamite, Vivian, Michael," she said, her eyes gleaming. "This isn't just about marital assets in the divorce anymore. This points to potential fraud, financial abuse. This could change everything, not just for Michael's case against Linda, but for your own position regarding Robert and any assets he might have tried to hide or give to her." The wheels of justice, as they say, grind slowly, but with this new evidence, they began to grind with a new, more purposeful intensity. Miss Albright's team started digging deeper into Linda's finances, into Robert's, looking for a trail that matched the entries in that damning little notebook. Linda, of course, continued her charade in court, all tearful innocence and wounded pride, but I could see the cracks beginning to appear in her composure, especially when Miss Albright would ask seemingly innocuous questions that hinted at undisclosed financial transactions, at sudden influxes of cash into Linda's accounts that didn't match her supposed income. Robert remained a ghost, a phantom voice on the phone. I told him about the notebook, about what I knew. He didn't deny it. He just sounded defeated, tired, an old man who had made a terrible, life-shattering mistake and now had to live with the consequences. Part of me, the part that had loved him for 50 years, ached for him,
But another part, the part that had been so cruelly betrayed, felt nothing but a cold, hard resolve to see this through, to protect myself and my son from any further damage. "You need to come clean, Robert," I told him during one call. "You need to tell Miss Albright everything you know about Linda's finances, about where our money went. It's the only way to mitigate some of the damage you've caused." He promised he would. Whether he'd follow through, I didn't know. But I had planted the seed. My life had become a strange landscape of legal consultations, quiet evenings with a still grieving Michael, and my own internal wrestling with the ghosts of my past. The question, "What do you do?" still echoed, but it was no longer a cry of helpless despair. It was a challenge I was meeting, one difficult day at a time. I was learning to navigate this new treacherous terrain, learning to be a fighter, learning that even a broken heart could still find the strength to demand justice. Linda had thought she could discard me like an old, worn-out shoe. She was about to learn that this old shoe still had a very sharp heel, and I wasn't afraid to use it. My confession was far from over. In fact, it felt like the most crucial chapters were just beginning to unfold.
Robert's secret notebook has become a weapon in the hands of Vivian and Michael. Linda is cornered, but will she admit defeat so easily? And can Vivian see this through to the end without breaking under the weight of new revelations and old grievances? The final battle for justice lies ahead.
The day Miss Albright presented Robert's grubby little notebook in the deposition hearing for Michael's divorce was a day I don't think I'll ever forget. Linda, who had been all cool composure and martyred innocence up to that point, actually gasped. Her lawyer, that slick shark, objected, of course, loudly. But Miss Albright, bless her sharp mind and even sharper tongue, had laid the groundwork perfectly. The notebook, detailing Robert's regular cash payments to Linda, her loans for non-existent investments, her emergencies that always coincided with his pension deposits, was admitted as evidence of a clear pattern of financial manipulation and potential fraud. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, though that was a festering wound that would take a long, long time to heal for both Michael and me. It was about premeditated, cold-blooded avarice. Linda hadn't just fallen into an affair with an older, infatuated man. She had systematically targeted him, exploited his weakness, and drained him of every resource she could. Resources that were, by right, ours. The fruit of my 50 years of marriage and Michael's rightful inheritance. The legal battle was still ugly, still drawn out. Linda fought like a cornered rat, trying every trick in the book, claiming the notebook was a forgery, that Robert had given her the money freely as gifts out of affection, that she was the one who had been emotionally abused in her marriage to Michael. But the evidence was too damning. The dates in the notebook lined up too perfectly with unexplained withdrawals from Robert's accounts, with Linda's sudden shopping sprees or mysterious investment opportunities that never panned out. Robert eventually was compelled to testify. Not in person. He was still in hiding somewhere, a pathetic, broken man, but through a sworn deposition arranged by Miss Albright. Faced with his own handwriting, with the irrefutable proof of his folly and Linda's manipulation, he finally broke down and confessed everything. The affair, yes, but also how Linda had played on his guilt, his loneliness, his foolish old man's desire to feel young and important again, bleeding him dry with sob stories and false promises. He admitted he'd even taken out secret loans, further indebting himself, all for her. The outcome for Linda was not the public flogging I had sometimes fantasized about in my darkest moments, but it was justice of a kind. The divorce from Michael was granted, and thanks to the evidence of her financial fraud and bad faith, her outrageous claims for alimony and assets were largely dismissed. She left the marriage with little more than what she'd come into it with: her looks, her cunning, and a reputation that, in our small community at least, was now thoroughly tarnished. I heard later she'd left town, probably off to find new prey in some other unsuspecting city. Good riddance. As for Robert, my husband of 50 years, that was a different kind of pain, a slower, deeper ache. My own divorce from him proceeded quietly, almost mournfully. There was no fight left in him. He agreed to everything Miss Albright proposed in the settlement. The house was to be solely mine. What was left of our joint savings was mine. He asked for nothing. When it was all finalized, he called me one last time. "Vivian," he said, his voice a mere whisper. I know sorry isn't enough. It'll never be enough. I destroyed everything. Our life, our son, your trust." "Yes, Robert," I said, my voice tired but clear. "Yes, Robert, you did. I'll live with that for whatever time I have left. I wanted you to know I loved you, Viv. In my own foolish, broken way, I did. And I loved Michael. I lost my way so badly." What do you say to that? 50 years, erased by a final, catastrophic act of weakness and betrayal. I didn't offer him forgiveness. I wasn't sure I ever could, not completely. But I didn't offer him more condemnation either. He was his own judge, his own jailer now. "Goodbye, Robert," I said, and gently hung up the phone. That chapter of my life was truly, finally closed. Michael, my dear son, bore his scars with a quiet dignity that reminded me so much of his grandfather, Frank. The betrayal by Linda, and by his own father, had cut him deeply. But he was a survivor. He threw himself into work, into therapy, into rebuilding his life. He leaned on me, and I on him. Our bond, already strong, was forged anew in the fires of our shared grief and disillusionment. We talked for hours, sometimes in anger, sometimes in sadness, sometimes even finding a moment for a dark, shared laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. He slowly began to heal. He started dating again, cautiously at first, then with a new wisdom, a new understanding of what he wanted and what he deserved. And me? Vivian Holloway, the woman whose world had been turned upside down, the woman who had asked herself, "What do you do?" in the face of unimaginable betrayal. Well, my confession, the one I'm sharing now, is my answer. I learned that you grieve, you rage, you cry until you think there are no tears left, and then you pick yourself up. You fight for what's right, for yourself, for your child. You learn that trust, once broken, can perhaps never be fully mended in the same way, but that life, somehow, goes on. I didn't get younger. I didn't get richer in the way the world measures wealth. My little house on Elm Street was still my sanctuary, but it was quieter now, filled with different kinds of memories, some beautiful, some achingly sad, all part of the tapestry of my long life. I found solace in my garden, in my quilting circle, in the quiet companionship of true friends. I found strength in Michael's healing, in his resilience. I found a new, harder-edged wisdom within myself. I learned that even at 67, a woman could face down betrayal and find her own path forward, not unscathed, but unbroken. My confession, isn't about a grand revenge, not in the way some stories tell it. There were no public humiliations for Linda beyond the whispers of a community, no dramatic confrontations where I got to deliver a final scathing monologue. My victory was quieter, more internal. It was in reclaiming my peace, my home, my son's well-being. It was in surviving. It was in learning that even after the deepest betrayal, a mother's love endures, not as a weakness to be exploited, but as a fierce, resilient strength. And it was in finally understanding that what you do when faced with the unthinkable is simply this: you endure, you heal, and you find a way to keep on living, with your head held high. That, I suppose, is the only answer there ever really is.